It's a complicated question, and it has many different levels. Of course, we just spoke minutes ago about the question of gratification, and gratification is the nightmare of artists. You want that, you're looking for that, but you have to know that it's very fugitive, and you can't rely on that, and it is not enough to keep you going, I think.
Okay.
I would say that the deepest reason for continuing so actively in art at my age, which is 71 years old, is a question of interest. I mean, when I really get involved in what I do is because it's around a problem that interests me and that I want to explore. And it is the depth of the interest in those problems that keep me going, I think. It's really because I'm interested in those questions and I want to find out. I don't know what, but I want to find out something about what's in this approach to images, relation to the world, relation to thought, and yeah, I guess that's the main thing. Well, I mean, in the last period, it's always, I guess, it always has to do with the trying to challenge the opacity of real life, real landscapes or places, or that you come in front of them and readily they don't have especially a meaning. And in order to raise them to the point of having a meaning, you need, well, in my approach, I feel I need to work on the image. So that's when I say the problems that interest me. It's not so much something like expressing myself, or it doesn't have to do with something that intimate or personal. It really has to be with the relationship with the, as I said, the opacity of real things, and find ways to go beyond this opacity and enter into a realm of meaning, and necessarily it has to do with history. One approach, one way to enter in the field of meaning is to look to those places or images or things in a historical way.
Yeah.
And I guess that's more or less always the point of departure of what I do. Well, I guess the main continuity is that I think I always had always was careful to keep a distance between myself and the images I was using, the tools I was using, so that there's always a reflexive distance between that. That was constant. So I guess I never went into only naive use of images. It always had this reflexive distance. I would say that this is the main continuity. The main difference is that if I think of my films of the early 80s, let's say, or even before then, they were more ideological. I was more into trying to convey ideas or opinions about the world. Well, generally they were rather political opinions, but I was pretty much into being sure enough of some ideas in order to try to, that it was worth it to try to convey them. This changed totally, and never were growing in age and never as sure about my opinions and ideas as I was at that time. So the impulse to try to convey them or the feeling that important is not a question anymore. So this is why now I say that it's more like a question of facing opacity and trying to find a crack in the opacity that allows to penetrate into it. And of course there's somehow political background, or there are political undertones to that, but never in the shape of trying to convey constructed opinions about things. I'm not. I guess I'm not interested in that anymore. I'm not. I don't think this is the most useful thing to do. I think it's more interesting to, as far as the relationship with the audience in connection with what you're trying to do, it's more important to have to get the audience to have the experience of looking for the cracks or the very small little point of entrance into reality, into images, rather than convincing them of something.
Yeah, of course.
Well, my work in the 80s was very much centered around scratching directly on film, which was a very particular relationship to the old technology of cinema, the old world of cinema. I liked it a lot because I considered it as something totally disruptive, and that was somehow the contrary of what should be done. You know, one of the main concern in what used to be one of the main concern in the world of cinema was not to scratch film. And of course, scratching it is taking as a point of departure the thing you should not do. So I sort of developed my whole little narrative about that, and as a rationale for the way to do that. So that was in a way at that time the point of departure of this reflexive distance I just talked about before, because it already from that way of understanding the fact of scratching on film, it gave some sort of critical distance to the whole technology of cinema, and opened up ways of approaching it and of using it that were very specific and which has a very specific character, actually, I think. And so at that time, my whole approach was based on using live images. That from the early 70s was always a constant, to always put my animation work in relation to live action images, and and the use of very sophisticated optical camera technology, which at the time was the tools that were used to do all the special effects and stuff, but to use them in and probably because of the fact that a lot of the elements that were used on the optical camera came from scratching on film, to use the optical camera in a very obvious way, so that the people watching the film would know that it was not an illusion created with some machines, but it was a construction of images made with those same machines, and never looking to create the illusion of an imaginary world, but to put in front of people a constructed world. I met Norman because I had tried to do some experimental stuff, scratch and painted on film. And actually I did that because I had friends at the art school that were doing that, like washing up 8mm film and doing things on it after. And that was, of course, under the influence of Norman McLaren's work. He was the most well-known filmmaker having done that type of work at the time. I'm talking about in the early 60s now, of the last century. Uh, and at one point I got to a sort of blockage because I had done a film that didn't have a soundtrack, and I went to this art cinema that would agree to show it if I would put some sound to it. And I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know nothing about the technology of cinema at that time. So I have asked a number of people, and sort of finally they told me, well, you should go and meet Norman McLaren. He could tell you how to do the sound by scratching it, but not needing any of the fancy technology. So that's how I called up Norman. And he accepted to see me. He explained to me how to do scratch sound, and which allowed me to do the scratch sound on that film, that first film, without not having to spend any money, money that I did not have anyway. So it was, and then I kept on visiting him. He was giving me black leader so that I can continue to do that work. And eventually, after maybe I'd done 2 or 3 films like that, he presented me to the producers of the animation studio at the National Film Board. And this is how I started to work at the National Film Board. There's a little more complexity to the story, but I mean, basically, this is what it is. And of course, Norman McLaren became a colleague.
Okay.
I mean, we're both employees of the National Film Board, and I kept remaining in contact with him for many years. That's one part of the story. The other part, which is the more, in my mind, in my work, he remained important apart from the fact that I could see him every day in a way. It's I guess the more important thing, of course, there's scratching on film. I got that from him. And it remained very important for me until the early 2000s. So, and it was not one technique amongst other. It was almost like a mystique of scratching on film for many years. And that came from Norman. But what came from Norman, which maybe is deeper than that, is the question of the relationship to technology. I feel that the way people see Norman's work as going on and inventing techniques all the time, all new techniques, is sometimes a bit superficial. And it's all based on a relationship with technology, which was an incentive for him to develop subject that always implied a technology problem, a problem of tools, and where the use of tools and matters was as important as the subject of the film in the usual sense of the term. So there's this very complex and reflexive relationship to technology, which makes it more than just choosing a tool amongst many other. That influenced me a lot, and it is still something active in my work. I would say that it's very deep. There's this idea which continued, and of course it was very decisive at the moment when I switched from analog technology to digital technology. I could understand and feel that this attitude of Norman McLaren in relation to the tools and techniques he was using was still active in me when I went into this major change which was at the end of the 90s and beginning of the year 2000, which led me actually to abandon scratching on film almost completely. which was something I could not have imagined would happen in my life.